lectures method, my lecture method, and make a labs method and lab method, anytime you start feeling yourself copying and pasting in this way, you're probably doing something wrong. So let's go ahead and fix. So let me go into, for today's examples, all of whose code is available online, let me instead go into version 9, which is only different in as much as it has labs in addition to lectures. So in this case, my home page looks only trivially different with these three options. If I click lectures, I see a similar format to before. Lecture 0, similar format as before. Back, and now labs is the same. So there's definitely an opportunity now to refactor my code and do this a little more cleanly. Yeah?
Can you scope controllers?
I'm sorry?
Can you scope controllers?
What do you mean scope controllers?
Have something inherit from a base controller?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, case in point, my own controller is inheriting from this. So one of the ways we could tackle this, and we'll look more at inheritance in the next lecture, is we could actually make our own controller from which all of our others descend if you want to have some common functionality. If that's what you were hinting at.
Rewrite methods in the CI controller.
Mm-hmm.
Would you have to like actually change that, or can you like do some kind of I don't know, PHP monkey patching for it? Or would you just write your own homepage beneath that and have everything inherent like the base one that you write?
So if I followed correctly, if you want to override methods that were implemented here, you simply implement them yourself here with identical names. And say,
I'm saying like you have to have your own base thing that everything else inherits from, because everything already inherits from the CI controller.
So short answer, no. No, you don't need any additional layer of hierarchy unless you find that you have this controller, this controller, this controller, this controller, and you find over time that, man, every one of these controllers has a foo method and a bar method. Let me factor those out by interposing in this family tree of controllers a middleman like that has that base functionality. But again, we'll come back to this type of design next time. But that's definitely an option. All right, so let's clean this up. And we do that in version 10 here. So in version 10, we have a slightly different structure. And let me just open the README, which already shows a little cheat sheet of the files in here. Almost all of this is the same, right? We've got our same templates at the bottom. We've got our home page up there. And notice at the top, though, notice at the top under controllers, I've introduced a separate controller now, one called lectures and one called labs. So let me actually go in there and see what's different this time. So first, in application, in config, in routes, notice that I've cleaned up the mess that I was starting to make. And I call it a mess because if you have to hard code half a dozen or more routes, there's got to be a cleaner way of doing this. And so sure, I'm going to go back to the original, and I'm just going to rely on CodeIgniter's default mechanism of /foo/bar/baz. So in my controllers now, notice I have a few controllers here. In welcome.php, I just used the same name this time rather than come up with an arbitrary homepage.php file. The only thing this welcome page does is it displays my main menu. So it displays a header, then the index, then the footer. So that's identical to what we had before. And those links include labs, lectures, and sections. So just to be clear, if I go into version 10 here, what we see is that. So that's all that's inside of that view called index.php. And just to be super sure on the same page, if I go into views and I go into welcome, index.php, that's all that's there. That's where that came from. All right, so the interesting part and the step forward this time is that now I have a lectures controller. And this is much closer to a good solution now to this problem. So class lectures extends CI controller. Why do you need that? It's just so that the whole system works together, among whose features will be index will get called automatically for us. So in the index method, notice we're doing the same thing as before. But this time, I'm opening the lectures/index file as the contents of this page. And then notice I ditched the lectures method. I decided this was a little sloppy, and so I'm going to tweak my URL scheme a little bit now to be consistent with CodeIgniter's defaults, and my function called lectures will still take a argument n so that we can pass it in to that template in this way. And again, just to make clear that there's really no magic here, in the index page, that's all that's there. It's still hard-coded, so there's still a little more room for improvement, certainly, in that I don't want to be hard-coding all this HTML every week. But if I now go into the lecture page, notice it is fairly like what it was before. So ugly URL, but it's just mapping to deterministically predictable URLs on our CDN server. Echo n is dynamically spitting out the number of the lecture, so we can get the right PDF and video. All right, so in the end, what does this version look like? Well, if I go to lectures, Notice the URL at the moment is, let's call it slash, because this is just messiness as the result of having so many examples in one lecture. So let's click lectures. Notice it changes to lectures. And now notice with lecture 0, it changes to be a little longer than before. We had slightly shorter URLs, but now it's a little clearer that foo, bar, and baz in this case are the lectures controller, the lecture method therein, and 0 is just an argument that's passed in. Any questions? All right, so what are we? Yep.
Yeah, so if your website's really big, you have a lot of links hard-coded in your HTML templates, right? Is there a way to abstract that out and tell CodeIgniter to generate that URL from your controller?
Indeed. So if you actually look at CodeIgniter's helpers class in its documentation, there's a number of methods related to URLs, one of which will give you the base URL of the whole project. But realize it was deliberate that I hard-coded the CDN links because those are on a different server altogether. All of my other links were actually relative. So it should be pretty portable. Other questions? Yeah?
What happens if your method takes more than one argument?
Good question. So the CodeIgniter folks have decided it would just be /0/x/y/z. You separate them by slashes. So you see this a lot, frankly, in blogging software and whatnot. When you have /year, /month, /date, it's the same idea that they're leveraging. Yeah?
These are always for gets, right?
These are for gets or could be for posts. They will be routed to the same controllers. Yeah?
Is there a way to only have, for instance, just the ID of, or the number of the lecture and not have any additional arguments show up in the URL?
So absolutely. We could really, you mean something like this?
Well, no, ask the question like, what happens if you have more arguments? You said they would just keep being appended as more.
You could do something like that, yeah.
But could you, if I had X, Y, and Z arguments, could I just have it show up as /0? Do you have to have all those slashes after?
Oh, no. So if you route it properly,
Right.
if X, Y, and Z are optional, then no, you would not need just ugly placeholders there just because.
Okay.
At this point, things get a little messy, though, to be honest. And what folks will typically do then is start to resort to traditional get or post parameters that would actually not just have this arbitrary slash convention. Yeah?
If you do use a traditional post, can both the controller and the view access it?
If you use it, short answer, yes, because index.php, which is CodeIgniter's main controller, will receive that request irrespective of it being get or post, and it will still route it accordingly, and it will pass it the contents of get or post. All right. So the biggest gap here is that really I have been using CP all the time to make each of these demos. And every week that there's a new lecture, I've got to go into these HTML files, the various views, and add yet another link and yet another link. So there's already an opportunity here to factor out that hard coding, actually use the M in MVC like a database. So let me propose that I'm going to go ahead and open up, let's say, a localhost /phpMyAdmin. Inside of the appliance, I'll log in as jharvard, password crimson. And in advance, I actually went ahead and created this jharvard lecture 2 database as an aside. As the online documentation says, any databases jharvard makes have to be called jharvard_ something for access rights. And I'm going to propose, just to keep it super simple, a lecture is going to be a table that looks like this. All right, it's got an ID, which uniquely identifies it. It's just going to be an integer. And it's got a name, which might very boringly be lecture 1, lecture 2. But in theory, it could be lecture 1, HTML5, or something to that effect. So we have that duality. And then under labs, we have the exact same idea, where we have an ID and a name. And what I went ahead and did is pre-populate this just so we have a working demo where labs has a lab 1 and lab 2, and lectures, if I clicked over, has the same thing. So in short, our data is now in a database, not in an HTML file. So how do we go about implementing the M in MVC, and how does this all sort of transcend CodeIgniter itself? So here is version 11, and the last version of these very underwhelming course website demos. So notice, for reference, I included a MySQL directory, totally arbitrary. This is not functionally related to CodeIgniter, but what I did so that if you want to play around at home, I did a export or a MySQL dump of the database we just looked at in phpMyAdmin. So it's in there. So if you've never seen these before, it just looks like a whole bunch of SQL queries along with some fancy SQL queries related to collation types and so forth. But it's the white and yellow text that's mostly of interest there. So all that does is create the structure that I had there. And for those unfamiliar, how do you import a SQL database into something like phpMyAdmin? You can use the import tab, right? You probably used that before, or at least the export tab. Or you can sort of do it the real way, whereby there is a MySQL command line client called MySQL, and this is available on most any system that has a MySQL database. The usage is typically -u for the username, like jharvard. -p means I will have a password for you. It's best not to put it here, because otherwise, why would you not put it there? So it gets logged in my history, and in fact, if you have nosy neighbors on the same system who are running commands like ps for process list or any number of other commands that show you what everyone else on the system is doing, well, they could, in that split second of time that your command is running, they can see what password you are using. So never should you include passwords on the command line if anyone else has access to the system. And what database do I want to use? Well, I want to use the Lecture 2 database that I created in advance. And then if I want to import the contents of that SQL file into this database, well, it's going to wrap onto 2 lines here. So let me do this on a separate line. MySQL-u, jharvard-p, jharvard_lecture2, and then input redirection. So you might remember this from 50 or similar, but you have the ability, jharvard-lecture2.sql. This will run the command on the left, and it will pass it as standard input, the content on the right, and it will even prompt you if you need to for the password. It doesn't exist because now I'm in the wrong directory. Then I could type crimson and hit enter. And so we'll actually see the command line client in a bit when we look at more sophisticated problems that arise with SQL in particular, called transactions and locks that help solve. All right, so here it is. The last example of a mobile, if underwhelming, course website, version 11. All right, so in application this time, there is still my same directories as before, but I've introduced a models directory. Let's assume that's a black box for the moment and just go into controllers. And in controllers now, let me open up lectures.php. And this now is what captures really the spirit of MVC, whereby thus far we've just had some logic and we've had views, but we haven't really done anything interesting like fetch some data and then prepare that data in some way and then pass the data to the view. The most we've done is pass in silly little strings like lecture1 or the number n. But now, thanks to this notion of a model, we can, in my method here, call a method like getLectures. So this is a method that I've written. This is an embodiment of the M in MVC. And apparently this getLectures method is inside of a class called lecture. And I can access that class, apparently, by way of this. So for those unfamiliar, and we'll spend more time on this in the future in both PHP and JavaScript, this just refers to what again? The current object. So right now we're inside of an object, specifically a lectures object. Notice that in the line prior, I'm telling CodeIgniter, hey, load the model called lecture, and that is just referring to a file we'll see in a moment called lecture.php, capital L. And the next line, what CodeIgniter does when you call load model, quote unquote, something, it then makes that model accessible to you via that syntax. This arrow and then the model name. So you might imagine this can very quickly start to cause collisions with other names and other features of CodeIgniter. Yes, so this is one of the downsides of most any framework. They made a design decision here whereby hopefully CodeIgniter itself has no special functionality related to lectures, because we would collide in this case. But it's fairly syntactically friendly. Yeah?
So is lecture here, is that using active record or whatever CodeIgniter uses?
Sort of. So we'll talk about active record and some other paradigms before long. It's kind of bastardization of active record, whereby it kind of does that, but it's not as clean as Ruby does or as some other frameworks actually do with active record. So we'll come back to this. Active record essentially means using a PHP class that maps directly to a row in a database so that any changes you make to the object are then reflected in the database. So we'll see that before long. So it's similar. And if you actually Google around, search around on CodeIgniter's documentation, you'll see how they qualify it as sort of active record. And they actually have an active record class that's a little more similar.
Right, but this doesn't extend that extensive of the default class.
No, right. Yeah. OK, so assume for now there's a class in the world called lecture. There's a method inside of it called lectures. And what that does is it returns an array of objects. And each of those objects represents a lecture. And inside that object is going to be an ID and a name for the lecture. All right, and thereafter, what am I doing with it? Well, I'm going to do the same exact thing as before, where if I want to alter the functionality of my view, I just have to pass in more data. So this time I'm passing in data in the form of this array called lectures. And so if I now look in my view, let me go into views, lectures, index, notice that